Rosemary, you just need to turn you need to unmute yourself so that we can hear you.
Hi, everybody. I was running to the stage. Can you tell? All right, let's get started. Let's talk about regulatory compliance. Yeah, that's how I like to start my day. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, everybody. Hopefully everyone can see. We're talking about data hygiene, and the thing to remember about data hygiene, it's very much like the mask hygiene and the germ hygiene everyone's talking about right now. It's all about establishing trust. So the other thing is to keep in mind that you're dealing with human beings when you're talking about data. So even though we're using the word data, we're talking about people and their real information. When we're talking about phone numbers, email addresses, even IP addresses, those all tie back to a real person. And that's the whole impetus behind all of these regulations that have come out. And so what I'd like to do today in a really short period of time is give you the lay of the land of how these privacy regulations got started, what is going on right now, and then as a community leader, a community manager, what do you need to know and what do you need to keep in mind while you're building your community to make sure you're doing it in a way that establishes trust with your community members. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you kind of a three-step process. First thing is what's going on, what are the guidelines that are out there, and there are a lot of them. The second thing to keep in mind is you want to collect as little as possible, because the less data that you have to deal with, the easier everyone's life will be. So that's really important to keep in mind throughout this whole process. And then the third thing is always make sure you have a system, because then you're not relying on haphazard, seat of the pants, like what did I do last week? Make sure you're documenting. When it comes to your data collection, your data treatment, and then training going forward. So I'm going to give you some good best practices and some of the ways that you can do this without actually losing your mind, because there's a lot to deal with out there. And I know we have an international audience, so I'll try to touch on as much as I can. I'm actually in the US, so one of the things I wanted to point out is we don't have a federal law like GDPR yet. It is probably coming, so everybody needs to pay attention to breaking news when it comes to the privacy regs. And I strongly recommend, if you have any dealings in this field, to set up some Google alerts, pay attention to the news that's coming out of Congress when we get back to talking about things other than COVID-19, to make sure that you're staying abreast of all these. Right now, we're looking at a patchwork across the United States. We're looking at lots of different states trying to implement things that will protect the data of consumers. When we're looking in the US at things like GDPR, we need to think about how does it apply to us? Because GDPR isn't just about EU citizens, and it doesn't just apply to EU companies. It may apply to you if you are actually having EU residents, which is someone who is living in the EU, visiting your site and using your online community. So those are some of the things you need to keep in mind. You can't just bury your head in the sand and be an ostrich and say, well, I'm not in Europe, this doesn't apply to me. And then also you have things that are just coming into play, like California's CCPA, which is actually going to affect anyone dealing with California consumers. And that is why you're suddenly seeing all kinds of websites at the bottom say things like, do not sell my information, because that law actually required sites to put a button at the bottom of the page. Features. This is something that is happening. Is start dealing with that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is most of these laws have varying degrees of enforcement depending on your revenue, how big your company is, where your members live, all sorts of data points like that. So I'll get into this a little bit more when we look into the worksheet, but always think about your own position in this. You may be exempt from some of the more strenuous requirements, but for me as a community leader, my headline to everyone is, you want to treat member data with respect, regardless of what guidelines or regulations you're subject to. It's important to establish trust early on and good housekeeping, good data practices, just by being a good community manager. Not necessarily because you're facing a multi-million-dollar enforcement action. We want to just build that into our processes right from the start. So this is my alphabet soup slide. And not everybody, you don't need to be an attorney. I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, but I do try to stay on top of how these things are shifting. And a lot of things can change between when a guideline or a regulation is proposed and when it starts to become enforced, and then you start building up case law and you start seeing how they're actually going to enforce it. One thing really to keep in mind is that intent does matter. So the actions that you take to at least try to comply and try to deliver a secure, private experience where your members can control their own data, if you can demonstrate that you are trying to do that, you're so far ahead of the game. Most of the enforcement actions have been taken on the larger social networks and some of the more egregious violations. So when you're looking at things like GDPR and CCPA, it's not to instill fear in everyone and to scurry off and oh my gosh, I can't have a community now because of all these guidelines. What you need to do is take what information am I giving up and where is it going once I give it to you? So being transparent and trustworthy and having good intent go a really long way. So don't be terrorized by all of these different guidelines. Just be aware and don't hide your head in the sand. So right now, there are some things going on to just be aware of. Right now, Facebook is fighting a battle with Ireland over data transfer. So you have to think about things like your data center. Where are your backups going? Where's the data going once it flows into your site, into your community? Think about your platform vendors, all the different third-party tools you're using. So that is something that's evolving, and we're all trying to pay attention and see what happens with that Facebook ruling when that's finalized. Also,
Rosemary,
the US.
Can I just interrupt you a second? We cannot see your slides. Sorry.
Oh,
I didn't
wow.
want to interrupt you too much, but I wanted to let you know that we can't see them. We can hear you perfectly and see you. We can't see the slides. So, yeah.
Any ideas on that?
Try stop sharing and then try resharing again, and hopefully that we can see them then. And if not, then what we can try and do. Okay. Yeah, we can see. If you then click yes. I think I can see it. Let's just make sure everyone else can see it. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Sorry to disturb you.
Yep. I'm so glad you told me. Thank you, Valentina. So everybody missed my beautiful shot of alphabet soup. But I don't like to read my slides, so you didn't miss any information. So that's a good thing. This one is my privacy shield. A lot of people know about the EU-US privacy shield that was in place for a long time. It is now in a state of flux. It got semi-tossed out. So just be aware, you know, if you're signed on to the privacy shield, it's still evolving. It may come back into play. That's something to stay on top of. And they're trying to figure out a way to get that back in place so that we actually have a way programmatically to deal with some of these regulations at a high level between our countries. So the other thing, CCPA, the California law, had a lot of delays in enforcement because of COVID. That's another one that's very much in flux right now, although enforcement is starting. That one more relates to actually selling data. So if you're running a nonprofit community and you're doing your thing, you're serving your nonprofit members, you probably, and you're not selling that information to anyone, you probably don't have much to worry about from that one. But just something to keep in mind. I do believe a federal privacy law is coming in the US at some point. It's being talked about. I think right now it's just been deprioritized a little bit, but I think that's something to definitely pay attention to going forward, because I think the patchwork effect isn't sustainable in the long run. So we're going to go through the actual worksheet, but just to give you a high level of what we're going to talk about. So analyzing the data you're collecting, that's things like your registration fields. What is PII is personally identifiable information, and each different guideline has a different way of interpreting that. It was kind of a bombshell when GDPR decided that IP addresses are PII. That was definitely a break from past guidelines. So there was a lot of scrambling going on there. Minimizing your data collection, I mentioned that. Privacy by design is definitely a mantra that is coming into play. So don't let your marketing department go nuts. And I say that with love as a marketer. Don't let them go nuts with the information you're collecting in your community. Getting informed consent, make sure you have terms when people sign up for your community, talking to your third-party vendors. And then also there's lots of automated tools out there for at least definitely for the consent and the cookie rule, where, you know, all those sites you go to and it says, wait, we're doing okay with you in 500 different ways. The reason you're seeing all kinds of different versions of that is the rule actually did not say, here's the right way to do it. So everyone's interpreting that differently. And I can tell you, talking to customers across the spectrum, different legal departments have different opinions on that too. So I always, again, go back to intent. So if you're coming at it with good intent and you're trying to be transparent, you're always going to be at least on the right side. So thinking about communities and forums, specifically branded owned communities, be super clear with what data you're collecting and what you plan to do with it. Think about allowing ownership for your members over the data that they are providing you after they provide it. So one thing that's really important is member autonomy and member control to some degree. If you're doing a support community and you're offering the community as part of your service offering for the members, you may have a vested interest, a legitimate interest in processing information. Like, I may need to give you my credentials in order for you to troubleshoot problems with the software. That's legitimate and that's fine. Where things go off the rails is where you start collecting additional information just in case for a rainy day. You don't want to do things like that anymore. Also, for GDPR compliance, it's pretty well accepted now that you can't just collect IP addresses up front. So you may need to disable that or get consent up front before you collect it. Another thing to consider is beyond the technology, the actual people behind the screens. So who has administrative access to all this data that's being collected? Your profile information, your member data, who can export it from the platform? Make sure that that is the smallest group of people possible. And if someone is fired or leaves, moves on to another job, you need to have that housekeeping mechanism in place so that you remove them from access when they leave. So you don't want to leave holes in the system like that. And that's why we talk about setting up processes. Make sure you train anybody that is going to be a moderator in the community. Maybe they have some limited access to the back end of your platform. Make sure that they're trained and they're knowledgeable and they know that be very, very secure and safe with that member data. And including volunteers. A lot of community sites use volunteer moderators. Always keep a close eye on what information they have access to and make sure you remove it when they're no longer volunteering. And then finally, where's your data center? Where's the data physically residing? Some countries actually have really stringent rules about where their consumers' data physically needs to be. So always look at things like that too when you're setting up your platform. And privacy policy building could be an entire multi-day session or workshop and a whole conference of its own. But here are just some high points as they relate to online communities and some of the things that I've just talked about. You want to make sure that you're using plain language. Make sure that you are including any links, like with the CCPA. Make sure you're giving people a way to opt out of selling their information, and designate someone within your operation who is in charge of this. One of the key requirements is that members can come and request deletion of their profile and their account data. Somebody needs to be receiving that information and responding in an appropriate way. You can't just hope that no one ever comes to you asking for that. So not only who's in charge of it, but what's your policy about that? So how are you going to respond when somebody makes a request for deletion? Are you going to delete their content as well? You are not required to delete forum content so far in terms of the way things are shaking out interpretation. You are not required to delete forum content. Usually the approach is to anonymize it when someone requests deletion. So their profile is no longer attached to the content that they've posted. That's the typical use case. That may evolve over time as well. And Valentina, let me know. We can go through a little bit of the check sheet, but I did want to leave some time for questions. I know we got started a little bit late. Okay, I'll go through a couple of real world examples that relate. And if we don't get, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, it takes me a while to turn on my video. Yeah, we're coming to we did start late, but we do have another session starting shortly. So if it's beneficial for you to go through more slides, or we can take some questions, it's up to you.
I'm providing the worksheet to everybody. So if you want to provide that URL, everyone can go ahead and use it. It's related to what I've just been talking about. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So I would like to open it up if there are any questions.
Sure. Okay, I've just shared the sheet. If anyone has a question, please drop it in the session chat and we'll go through a few of those before we end today. I know that this has been a bit of a crazy start, but you know, 2020 has been crazy. So, okay, any questions for Rosemary at this time? Wow, no questions?
That's it. I explained everything so detailed. This is really an important subject, so hopefully we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think Piper might have a question. She says, yes, is advising people when, is what she writes. I don't know if that was a question or if that was a comment. Is advising people when they sign up that we collect IP addresses sufficient? No, it has to be proactive. So if you're under that requirement and you're trying to abide by GDPR, the interpretation I've seen from most legal teams is that you cannot have already collected the IP address. And typically that is what happens when someone comes to your community. Usually that has already happened by the time they get in and start registering, unfortunately. Nikki says, thank you. You mentioned Cookie Pro. If you have other examples, that would be great.
You know what I can do? I will do a follow-up, maybe a tweet with some recommendations. That's the one that stood out because it's easy to use and it's quick and it'll run through your whole site and spit out all the cookies. I think Chrome also does have a built-in cookie detector. So you can use Chrome too to auto-detect if you're using it.
Perfect. I will share your Twitter so that people can follow you. Chat.
Yeah, I'm totally open to, you know, if you come up with a question tomorrow, just DM me or tweet me. I love talking about this stuff.
All right, we've got time for one more. Marissa says, is there a limit to how long you keep an email address on file? Say if the account has been inactive, should we be purging accounts after a certain period of time other than for just simple house cleaning?
It's good practice to purge out, but there's no requirement in terms of how long you can keep it, especially if you have a contractual relationship. If you're the kind of community where it's a product and it's a support community, as long as you have a contractual relationship with that person, you can retain that information. And most of the guidelines surround the member coming to you and requesting deletion and you responding to that. Most of them are not putting in place, you know, after 5 years, you have to purge that data.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, I'm conscious of the time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reshare the checklist again along with your social handles so that if anyone has any more questions, you can reach out to Rosemary that way. Please give a big virtual standing ovation in the form of emojis and positive vibes in the chat for Rosemary, our very first speaker here on the forum stage. I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties, but you did amazingly, so thank you so much. And yeah. Looking forward to connecting with you on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Thanks so much. Everybody enjoy the rest of the sessions.
All right, we're going to be back in a few minutes with our next speaker. Don't forget, you can go and check the agenda for all the other different things that are happening. One tip that I would say is instead of leaving a session to see the agenda, have it open on a separate screen so you can cross-reference as you go. I'll be back in a second with our next speaker. I'll see you then.